They told the world they were bringing freedom. They said they would liberate the oppressed, defend human rights, and restore peace. But 2 decades later, we're left with a question. Were these just noble lies? This is a story of war, of strategy, and of the hidden costs of intervention. This is the story of how freedom became a pretext. In March 2003, the United States led a coalition into Iraq, claiming Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. The world watched as cities were bombed, statues fell, and a regime collapsed. But no WMDs were ever found. What followed wasn't peace, but years of insurgency, a deadly civil war, and the birth of ISIS. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians were killed, millions displaced. The country's infrastructure was shattered. So was it really about weapons, or something else?
There's overwhelming evidence that strategic interests, such as control over oil and regional dominance, were major motivating factors. WMDs were the cover story.
The invasion wasn't just about removing Saddam Hussein. It was about reshaping the Middle East according to Western strategic interests. Internal documents later revealed that plans for regime change in Iraq existed long before 9/11's. The weapons of mass destruction narrative provided the legal and moral justification the public would accept. But the real agenda was geopolitical dominance in a resource-rich region. In 2011, Western powers turned to Libya. NATO launched airstrikes under the banner of humanitarian intervention to stop Muammar Gaddafi from massacring his own people. Gaddafi fell, but what came next was a descent into chaos. No functioning state, rival governments, armed militias, slave markets. Libya became a failed state. The intervention, though swift and surgical, had no plan for peace. Removing a dictator is easy. Building a democracy, that's the hard part. And Libya showed what happens when you skip that second step. The humanitarian intervention that was supposed to save lives created a humanitarian catastrophe. Libya went from being Africa's most prosperous nation to a breeding ground for terrorism and human trafficking. The very people the intervention was meant to protect became victims of the chaos that followed. Oil production collapsed. Basic services disappeared. Society fractured along tribal lines. Afghanistan was the first target after 9/11's. The Taliban were removed, but 20 years later, after trillions of dollars and thousands of lives, the Taliban returned to power. What was achieved? The West promised to bring democracy and stability. But after 20 years of nation-building, the system collapsed in just 11 days. Over 47,000 civilians died in the war. More than 2.7 million Afghans fled their country. Was the mission ever clear, or was it doomed from the start? The initial goal was to capture Osama bin Laden and destroy al-Qaeda. That could have been achieved in months, not decades. But the mission expanded into nation-building, democracy promotion, and social engineering. Afghanistan became a laboratory for Western ideals, imposed on a society that had its own complex history and culture. The result was a puppet government that collapsed the moment Western support was withdrawn. 20 years of occupation achieved nothing that couldn't have been accomplished in 2. Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan. The stories differ, but the pattern is clear. Promised humanitarian missions, followed by long-term instability. These wars were sold to the public using the language of freedom and protection. But behind closed doors, internal memos and intelligence suggest deeper motives. Strategic military footholds, control over vital resources, countering rival powers like Iran, Russia, and China. These weren't just missteps. They were deliberate choices, often with foreseen consequences. The public case for intervention is rarely the whole story. It's often the one people will support, not the one driving policy. Think tanks manufacture consent. Media amplifies the message. Politicians sell the narrative. The same phrases appear in every intervention. Humanitarian crisis, responsibility to protect, spreading democracy. But the classified documents tell a different story. One of strategic competition, resource control, and geopolitical advantage. The gap between public justification and private motivation reveals the true nature of these interventions. The human cost of interventionism is staggering. Millions of lives disrupted, generations growing up in war zones. Trauma doesn't end when the troops leave. Veterans struggle with PTSD, refugees seek safety, And in the void left behind, extremist groups flourish. These aren't isolated mistakes, they're systemic failures. And yet, the language of freedom remains a powerful shield. The same rhetoric that justified past interventions continues to shape current policy debates. Each intervention creates the conditions for the next crisis. Iraq's chaos gave birth to ISIS. Libya's collapse destabilized the Sahel. Afghanistan's war spread to Pakistan. The promise of surgical strikes and quick victories always gives way to prolonged occupation and unintended consequences. Local populations pay the price for geopolitical games played by distant powers. Children grow up knowing only war. Families are torn apart. Communities are destroyed. The cycle of violence perpetuates itself, creating new justifications for future interventions. Have we learned anything? Or are new pretexts already being written? In today's world, from Ukraine to Taiwan to the Middle East, the temptation to intervene remains. The stakes are higher, the tools more complex. But the core question stays the same. When is intervention just? And when is it a smokescreen? The same think tanks that promoted past interventions are now advocating for new ones. The same language of freedom and democracy is being deployed to justify new conflicts. We can't undo the past, but we can question it, challenge it, and demand that next time, if there must be a next time, the truth comes before the bombs. Because history deserves more than pretexts. The victims of these interventions deserve more than noble lies. And future generations deserve leaders who choose diplomacy over deception, truth over propaganda, and peace over the pretexts of freedom. The real question isn't whether we can intervene, it's whether we should. And that question demands honest answers, not manufactured consent.